This is an exclusive excerpt from the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder.
Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Glenn Frankel is back on the show. He was last on with us back in 2017 when his book High Noon, The Hollywood Blacklist and the Making of an American Classic came out. Well, now Glenn is doing another deep dive. He is the author of Shooting Midnight Cowboy, Art, Sex, Loneliness, Liberation, and the Making of a Dark Classic. Glenn joins us once again on the line from Virginia. Hi, Glenn.
Hi, how you doing, Peter?
Just tickety-boo. Thanks very much for being on the program with us once again. Pleasure to have you back on. When I was a film student, which I was, we spent an entire semester going frame by frame through this particular movie, Midnight Cowboy. So this is right in my wheelhouse. What made you come up with this idea for your next project, for this book?
Well, I had done books about High Noon and the searchers to classic American Westerns. I was looking for something a little more modern. I've used these books, Peter, not only to write about the making of a great American movie, but to write about the era they were made in and that they reflect. So these books are like half movies and half history, and they sort of shuffle themselves together. And Midnight Cowboy was made in the late 60s, which, as you know, is a very lively, dangerous, anxious time in our history. Not only our political history, with a certain amount of resonances to today's history, but also in terms of culture and art. I mean, the walls were coming down on a lot of barriers from a long time. Hollywood was going under, a lot of changes. They got rid of their old censorship system and put in the rating system because trying to appeal to younger audiences, trying to break down barriers. And so it was a rich mix for me and exactly the kind of thing you look for when you do a book like this.
Okay, so the film was actually the winner of the Best Picture at the Academy Awards that year, and it's the only X-rated film to ever win Best Picture at the Academy Awards. So let's back up a little bit. First of all, did it deserve the X rating?
Well, the X rating is a complicated story. It's been told one way over the years about these, prudish censors giving it an X rating because they think it's much too adult with the kind of sex in the movie. But in fact, the rating board gave it an R originally, and it was United Artists, the studio behind the film, that got queasy about especially some of the gay sex scenes. There's no nudity, but it's a pretty raw movie in many ways. And so they gave it the X. But then it went out, and as you say, it won the Academy Award for Best Picture, the only movie ever rated X to win that. And so United Artists turned around then and realized they had a movie that was critically successful. They had a movie that was popular. Midnight Cowboy made good money, and they wanted to take full advantage. So they asked to knock it down to an R, and the ratings board did so without any controversy at all. But what the X rating sort of represented, I think, was just how unusual Midnight Cowboy was, how groundbreaking it was, and how much audiences were ready for that kind of thing in 1969.
Well, let me ask you this. Since it got the X rating, was the X itself actually a curiosity and titillation for those, not necessarily in the general population, but for the movers and shakers behind the business itself and the Academy to give it a harder look?
Well, I think it didn't hurt. I think the folks who marketed the movie were very clever about using the X rating to their benefit. Everything you've heard about Midnight Cowboy is true, was one of the taglines in the ad. So yes, to a certain audience, again, a younger audience, an audience looking for something new, this was very appealing. The studio guys, they were all over the place. I mean, they were desperate people in the late 60s. The old genres, including, sadly, the Western, biblical epics, movie musicals, those genres had run out of gas. And they'd run out of appeal. And the audience was getting younger, more college kids, more, people looking for something different. It all came together. Not just with Midnight Cowboy. You get a movie like Easy Rider that cost a couple $100,000 to make, and it makes a fortune, relatively speaking. And The Graduate, I mean, there's suddenly new things are happening, and yes, the X rating really was, in the end, it was an attractive point. It's one of the reasons there were lines out the door. I got to say, though, having Dustin Hoffman, who'd just come off of The Graduate, where suddenly he'd become this kind of, counterculture icon, that didn't hurt either.
Well, you mentioned The Graduate and Dustin Hoffman. The other star of this movie is Jon Voight, who was, at that time, a fresh new face. How did the two of them come to these two roles?
It's interesting because, when we look at it now, they look like such naturals for it. Voight's the tall, blonde guy, and Hoffman's the little ethnic guy playing these interesting characters. But at the time, the director, John Schlesinger, really didn't want either of them. I mean, Hoffman had just become a big movie star, and Schlesinger didn't want to pay the bill for that, and also was afraid he didn't see how the guy who played a college grad in The Graduate could look like a down-and-out bum in New York in Midnight Cowboy. But you didn't realize what a great actor Hoffman was. Anyway, they hire Hoffman first, and eventually they settle on Jon Voight. Even again, this is not the guy Schlesinger really wanted. But these two guys, they come out of New York acting schools. They know what to do with these parts, and they know what to do with each other. They're both competitive, but also collaborative, and they sort of push each other, over the line. And I think that's one of the reasons the movie still resonates, because these guys are just so good. I don't know about you. I can't think of any male performers in a major movie who are better than these two guys.
You mentioned Easy Rider. You mentioned this particular film. Was this also a turning of the page as far as not necessarily young actors are concerned, but young directors?
Well, yeah. I mean, it was a time when nobody knew anything in Hollywood, and when they were interested in new people. I mean, Schlesinger was from the UK. He'd made 3 or 4 quite successful movies in Britain, so he wasn't exactly a fresh young thing, and a lot of people wanted to work with him, but they didn't necessarily want to make a movie like Midnight Cowboy about some guy from Texas who comes to New York, think he's going to become a male hustler. I mean, that was a little over the limit, and it took a place like United Artists to be interested. But yeah, they were looking, there was a search out there for rebels, for iconoclasts, for people who might hold the key for Hollywood to recover itself. And the new Hollywood, as it's called, was only for a very brief time, but you get people like Robert Altman making MASH, you get Martin Scorsese in Mean Streets, you get all these interesting sort of experiments, if you will. Some of them work, a lot of them are, don't necessarily make money, but they're part of a new frontier that lasts for a few years. And then the blockbuster came along and everything changed again.
Now, in the case of James Leo Herlihy, who wrote the book, and also the director, as you mentioned, John Schlesinger, they were both gay. This goes back to the late 60s, when this is not something that was talked about at all. The fact that you had a gay novelist and a gay director helming this U.S. film, which ended up with an X rating, there were a lot of hurdles to climb, I would assume, in just getting this to the theater in the first place.
Well, it never would have happened 5 or 10 years earlier. I mean, you'd occasionally see a gay character in a movie, and even gay subject matters in a few Hollywood movies, but the gay people involved always either ended up dead or in serious trouble. Being homosexual is bad for your health in a Hollywood movie. It just wasn't anything real. But here we are in an era where the walls have started to come down, and not just in movies. You see The Boys in the Band, the first sort of mainstream gay play, very successful off-Broadway. You see novels of different kinds with different kinds of adult sexuality. Suddenly, the walls have come down. So it was a haul, and neither of these guys, Herlihy was quite clear on it. This is not a gay novel, and John Schlesinger kept saying this is not a gay movie. But there is an undercurrent, and there is a sort of frank depiction of homosexuality in Midnight Cowboy that you can't deny, and that in a way, sort of paves the way for much different attitudes and much different movies starting in the 70s. It is a breakthrough. And that's one of the reasons why it was so interesting to write about, because in so many ways, Midnight Cowboy is on the frontier of the future.
Okay, last question, true or false? Because this is something that came up when we studied the film oh so many years ago, and that is the famous scene where the cab cuts off Dustin Hoffman and he slams the hood and says, "We're walking here," was an ad-lib. The cab shouldn't have been there, and that was not a line.
It was an ad-lib, but the cab was in the script. The cab was supposed to be there.
Okay.
But what isn't there is Hoffman's line. That's one that he pulled out himself, and he pulled it out of a hat right as it was happening. So the story's half true, but it's a great story and a great moment, memorable moment.
And it's a great film, and I'm sure this is going to be another one of your great books. This one is called Shooting Midnight Cowboy, Art, Sex, Loneliness, Liberation, and the Making of a Dark Classic. Glenn, I thank you very much once again for being on the program with us.
Well, it's great to talk to you, Peter. Thanks a lot for your time.
Glenn Frankel, author of Shooting Midnight Cowboy, Art, Sex, Loneliness, Liberation, and the Making of a Dark Classic. You can go to my website at thestuffile.com, check out the show number for this program, which is show number 0606, and you'll find links to Glenn's site, plus links to either Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, where you can order his book directly.
You've just heard an exclusive excerpt from the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder. To hear any or all of the full hour-long shows, visit thestufffile.com. Stuff is spelled S-T-U-P-H. That's thestufffile.com. A presentation of Flying Fish Communications.